Welcome to the Unlist. Today is the Christmas Eve Unicorn Special. If you guys are actually willing to watch one of my videos on Christmas Eve, even better. If not, I guess you'll catch it after. But I filmed this and queued this up for release on Christmas Eve so I could have a Christmas Eve video, right? Because I didn't have one last year. So here we go. And I'm calling it the Christmas Eve Unicorn Special because I'm talking about rare and vaunted worshipped fragrances, at least ones that I have in my collection that I can show you bottles of. I can't do that with every unicorn I've ever smelled. I don't own them all. So I need to be pretty rich, actually, to own a lot of them. What is a unicorn? Okay, let's pretend that you've never been around me before. Never been around the fragcom. Don't know the lingo. I don't know who coined the term, but the word unicorn usually applies to a fragrance that has been basically put on a pedestal and the price reflects it. It doesn't always have to be a discontinued fragrance, but it usually is. It could be a limited edition fragrance that only had a set number of bottles. So you can say that an Arige L'Adore or a Slumber House fragrance can be a unicorn because it was never intended to be produced past X number of bottles. So you can't say it's discontinued because it was just never produced beyond those numbers anyway. But typically it is discontinued. Doesn't have to be vintage either. It can be a recently discontinued fragrance. It could be something that was discontinued 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Most unicorns do tend to be in that at least 80s and 90s era. You get some from the 2000s, but at least in that 80s, 90s era. And then back. But there really aren't unicorns older than the 70s. Just because typically the way it works, people tend to venerate and worship the things they had when they were younger. And all the guys who were in their 20s in the 80s and 90s who are in their 40s and 50s now, right? Well, no, they'd be older than that now. Shit, I'm sorry. My math is fucked up. They'd be in their 60s now. If you were in your 20s in the 80s, you'd be in your 60s now. If you were in your 20s in the early 2000s, you'd be in your 40s now, like me. See, okay, this is why I was a D math student. Clearly, I was not good at math. I'm more of a history and writing and language kind of guy. Arts and crafts. The brain is over here. It's not over here. But point is, the Overton window right now for unicorns is probably late 70s through early 90s because those guys who were in their 20s in the late 70s through to the early 90s, they're in their 60s and 70s now, and they've reached their peak spending power. They have accumulated probably the most wealth they're ever going to have, and they're going to knock out in another 20 years. Unless they live to be 100 like Dick Van Dyke or something, they're probably not going to be around for a whole lot longer. So they're the ones doubling and tripling down on all of the things that they wore when they were still studying around, right? Trying to get laid, trying to get girls or other guys. So all the discontinued fragrances that end up being the most worshipped, the most vaunted, are the ones from the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. I imagine in another 20 years that window will shift and suddenly all the unicorns will be from the late 90s and the early 2000s, possibly the early 2010s. I hate to say it, but someday something like Bleu de Chanel could end up a unicorn, right? But we're not there yet. Meanwhile, older things that were made in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and even the 60s now, nobody seems to care. You can buy vintage bottles of Brut all day. You can buy vintage bottles of Eau Sauvage. They're not super cheap, but you can get them. You can get vintage bottles of a lot of that stuff from the 60s, and the price is just not there now. Maybe it was there 10, 20 years ago. It's not there now. But you try to buy something from the 70s, from the 80s, oh yeah, you're going to pay. So now you know what a unicorn is. Obviously, scalpers have a part to play. Influencers generating hype also have a part to play. But I've done videos on that, so I'm not going to do that here. This is a unlist where I name things for you. So without further ado, knowing what a unicorn is, let me go over some of my favorite unicorn fragrances for our Christmas Eve unicorn special. Let's ride our unicorns into battle. Let's do it. All right. Let's start off with not exactly a favorite, but it's one of my favorite ones to mention. That makes sense? Not a favorite, but one of my favorite ones to mention. Why? Because I proved a point with this. And the point I proved was that the price often makes the desirability more than the scent does. Because it's expensive, people think it must be really good. Oh, that vintage Calvin discontinued. It's the first one. Look, it's like $400. Must be really good. And I was able to get a lot of people to not buy it. I don't know how I had this power. It's very early on in my days on Base Notes. I wasn't that well known, but I convinced a lot of people to just don't click, right? Just sit, just wait. And eventually, the sellers started dropping prices because they didn't like sitting on dead weight. People who flip fragrances, who buy a bunch of fragrances and sit on them, if their stock is not moving, their space and their time becomes more valuable than the stuff that they're trying to flip. So then they lower the prices. They're like, we got to dump this and get something else. People aren't taking the bait. It's like cryptocurrency, right? It has this ups and downs. So bought a bunch of these when they were cheap. Tried to jack them up. Nobody was buying them because I managed to convince people not to. 400, 300, 200, 150. It came all the way down to like $85. 2017, 2018, being able to get this for $85 was crazy. So a bunch of people started buying them again, myself included. I got one for $85. Sure, I'll buy one. And then as soon as that happened, oh, the demand is back. Oh, people are buying it. Back up it went. But I made my point. The smell of the fragrance, it's pretty good. It's your typical musky, aromatic, powerhouse fougere. The unique quality to this is chamomile. It has a chamomile note in it, which is really uncommon. The only other vintage fragrance that I've really smelled that has a chamomile note in it for men is Balafre by Lancome 67. Balafre's got a chamomile note in it as well. It's kind of strange and good. But this one, it's more prominent. It definitely sticks its head out a bit more. Most Calvin Klein fragrances are very soft anyway. Even if they're potent, like Obsession's potent, they're still very round and soft. Euphoria, Contradiction, Escape, CK1, very soft, very round. That's just kind of what they do. They don't make pungent, sharp, overly musky. Calvin Klein is just not the house for that. So even though this is more conventional than the later ones would be, not as futuristic, it still has that softness, the Calvin Klein softness. So therefore, it does still kind of feel like it belongs with the rest of them in that regard. Now, next up, this 2003. It is vintage now. It's 21 years old, but originally it wasn't really vintage. And the thing about this was, I remember when this was considered a starter fragrance because it was cheap. Nobody wanted it. And if you joined Base Notes, you joined Fragrantica, if you got on Facebook, you got on Reddit, you ask people, what should I get? I'm trying to branch out. I'm trying to get away from Dracar Noir, or I'm trying to get away from Bleu de Chanel. I'm trying to get away from generic Fierce or whatever. People would tell you this. They would say, oh, it smells like shave cream. It's so good. The best shave cream you've ever smelled. They weren't lying. It is like the best shave cream you ever smelled. But it didn't sell well because in 2003, people didn't want to smell like shave cream. Tom Ford, however, being Tom Ford, didn't really care. He doesn't make what the market wants. He makes what he wants. And he doesn't care how many billionaires or stockholders he loses money for. He will lose money for everyone, so long as he does what he gets to do. That's all he cares about. And that is exactly why he was no longer at YSL and no longer at Gucci after a while, because Tom Ford was just going to Tom Ford. He had succeeded in getting everyone upset at him and ruffling all the feathers, which controversy generates sales in the fashion world. Clothes, yes. With perfumes, no. Controversy will sell clothes. It will not sell perfume. So even though all of the Tom Ford stuff for YSL and Gucci clothing-wise was legendary, the perfumes languished in discounters because all he ever wanted to do was make old stuff, make retro stuff, make traditional classic stuff. He was basically just worshiping his heroes, his perfume heroes. He was worshiping them with his fragrances. And thus he did that here with this. And it just wasn't a good fiscal situation. And these were $20, $35 for a very long time. They moved it to a new bottle, a glass bottle. And then those didn't sell either. So, but yeah, now that it's a unicorn and it's venerated and it's like $400 a bottle, people will sit there and tell you that it's the best thing ever, and it is very good. But if you can't get your hands on this, if you want a fragrance that smells like Barbasol, you really want a Barbasol fragrance, a shave cream foam can fragrance, you don't want to pay blood money for this, let me show you a good alternative. This guy right here. I'm not too keen on the fact that he has my name, that Derek is on the bottle. That really disturbs me, but this is another really good shave foam sort of fragrance. It's got a weird jerry can bottle, but oh well. If you were able to deal with a tin can, you can deal with a jerry can, all right? Not too much different. Likewise, if you're a fan of this and you don't want to pay blood money for it, you want something that's close, similar, you get the Enrico Coveri instead. Still expensive, still over $100, discontinued, but not insane like this. Not insane. And every now and then, the Enrico Coveri does come down in price because someone finds another stash of them somewhere, the unsold inventory, and the prices crash back down to $30, $40. Then they go jump back up to 80 again. It just kind of does the roller coaster. But you'll never pay Calvin prices for it. So, now, moving on to another unicorn. I did a big video on Ho Hong. So even though Ho Hong is one of my favorites, especially of my discontinued things, I am not featuring it in this video because I've already talked about it extensively. I don't want to talk about it again. But for the record, Ho Hong is one of my favorite unicorns. And I'll show you the club bottle. Here's the club bottle. I've got the regular bottle down in the cabinet, but here's the club bottle. But if you want to learn all about Ho Hong and my feelings on it, then feel free to watch my video on it. Other unicorns? Rare and exquisitely discontinued. Yes, exquisitely discontinued. Let's talk about this one right here. Ted Lapidus Pour Homme. Not to be confused with Lapidus Pour Homme. This fragrance is a sort of cade oil kind of leather, so it's not super animalic, it's not super aldehyde powdery, it's not black shoe polish like Tom Ford. It's a very brown belt, brown shoe buckle kind of leather with a little bit of honey in it, okay, some spices, some cinnamon, very 70s, very walnut trim and harvest gold shag carpet. But unfortunately it didn't sell well because L'Oreal was not a good fit for Bogart. So, sorry, not Bogart. L'Oreal wasn't a good fit for Ted Lapidus. And because they weren't a good fit, Ted Lapidus left L'Oreal and went to Bogart. Bogart basically got the fragrance deal taken away from L'Oreal. And L'Oreal was salty about it, so they didn't allow them to have the formulas, which meant they had to reboot everything. So VU and Ted Lapidus Pour Homme went away, were replaced by this and Creation. So the original line of Lapidus, his and hers perfumes, is basically lost forever. Sad as it may be, lost forever. Now, moving on. Next, Unicorn. Speaking of Bogart, it's another Bogart brand, like Lapidus. Balenciaga at one point belonged to Bogart. Not anymore. Now they belong to Kering. And I think Coty has the license for the fragrances, but they belong to Kering now. But back in 1990, they were owned by Bogart. This fragrance was another starter fragrance. 20, 30 bucks all day, every day. You wanted a spicy, animalic, amber with some Middle Eastern touches long before we even cared about Middle Eastern touches. This is before all the ouds and stuff were around. And this does have a tiny bit of Hindi oud in it, but it's not listed. It doesn't list the Hindi oud in the ingredients because back in 1990, no one would have known what that was or cared. So they didn't bother listing it, but it is in there. You can clearly smell it. So you get a little bit of that barnyard, dirty birdie kind of phenolic thing. And then you get the vanilla bourbon, you get patchouli, you get cedar, a lot of like just really kind of rose geranium type notes in the heart, a little bit of carnation. I would not call this a full rose oud. It's not a rose oud, but it's very similar to a rose oud. And the closest thing you're going to find to this now is like Oud Palau by Diptyque, which is actually cheaper than this sells. This sells for like 500 bucks. It's insane. And we kind of have Sebastian Jarre to thank for this because these were getting expensive a little bit. I mean, I paid $80 for this one. So it's definitely getting a little more expensive, but he got up on his YouTube channel and I guess this was his religious. He had like a speaking in tongues like experience, right? He saw Christ or whatever in this fragrance. And all he could constantly do is say, it's a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece. It's so gorgeous. It's so beautiful. You need to buy it. You need to buy it. You need to get one. It's a masterpiece. You need to get one. You need to get one. It's a masterpiece. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. Wouldn't shut the fuck up about it. And you know what happens? All the scalpers were like this. Especially when you got a large following, right? Like he does. So, and I'm just like, bro, if you're going to spend $500 on this, just get like a real rose oud attar, right? Go get something from Amouage or Swiss Arabian or whatever. Or if you really want to spend that kind of money, Sultan Pasha, okay, right? Ensar Oud. Go get a Feel Oud, something from Russian Adam. You're going to spend big bucks. don't spend it on this. Because this was always like a halfway house, like rose oud fragrance. You know, you're going to spend that kind of money. Get the real shit. All right? Don't get something that's some self-important influencer guy who makes money off of basically selling you snake oil, you know, because he said this is a masterpiece. Okay, whatever. Don't do that. Just saying. And shame on all the sellers. Shame on all the sellers that are basically selling you a Bogart fragrance for $500 fucking dollars. Okay? Because that's a Bogart fragrance. Balenciaga was owned by Bogart when that came out. So you're getting Bogart level of production from beginning to end. And you're paying Creed money for it because some guy with a white hat told you it's the essence of God or something. It's ridiculous. Ridiculous. So, moving on. Another unicorn, right? Another rare, expensive, blah, blah, blase, blase, blah, blah, blah. So, see, my problem is a lot of these I had when they were cheap. So, I have a hard time seeing them as anything more than what they originally were when I got them. That's my big takeaway, okay? So, you have to pardon me for not being super enthusiastic about it because I can't worship something that I got at a discount price, and my level of appreciation is different than someone who's invested a significant portion of their money, right? You dump $300, $400, $500 into a bottle of vintage perfume, then you're invested. You know, whether you agree or not, you're invested. You spend that kind of money on it, especially blind. You blind buy it for like that much money, you are invested. So you kind of convince yourself that it's good because you have to. You can't send it back. Most of these eBay sellers don't take shit back. So unless you can prove it's fake or something, but these two were also starter fragrances. Fragrances that, like my Rive Gauche over here, just like this one, people were like, oh, it's $25. It's a great thing to start off with, right? So I was one of those people. I would tell you, if you met me in 2015 or whatever, like 10 years ago, and you were to ask me, oh, I want a good high quality fragrance for not a lot of money. I'm trying to branch off. I'm trying to get away from Cool Water or Tommy or Bleu de Chanel or Kenneth Cole. I'm trying to branch out to something a little bit better. I'd be like this. Tsar. All day, every day. Fantastic. Aromatic fougere. Okay. Has a lovely sort of sour, sporty feeling. Before that kind of like Adidas sport vibe was really a thing. Juniper. Okay. It's just got such a uniquely dynamic smell. That's the best way I can describe it. A very dynamic smell. And people compare it to Gucci Nobile. I don't really see it. People compare it to Caesar's Legendary Man. Don't really see it. Not really. But it's definitely of that generation of fougere for sure. It's just a little different than all of them. But $25, fantastic. $400, not fantastic. So same thing. These just, and you can't blame an influencer for this one. So you can't blame anyone like Jeremy Fragrance or Gent Sense or Fragmental, or I just mentioned the fragrance guy, Sebastian Jara. It's not their fault. None of them are to blame. Blame the brand. Van Cleef and Arpels in like 2000 and I think 20 or 21, they decided they didn't want to make entry-level designers anymore. They wanted to move up into that privé market, that Dior privé, that less exclusive range, right? They wanted to go up there in that $300-$400 range. So they took all of their normal designers and killed them off. Women's and men's alike, all gone. The only one they kept was First, the original First of Van Cleef and Arpels with Jean-Claude Elena as perfumer. They kept that one. All the others discontinued. Zanzibar, gone. Midnight in Paris, gone. Midnight in New York, gone. All of them. Okay, all of them gone. Eventually, these two would reappear as boutique exclusives in France. So if you want to get on a plane and fly out to Paris and drop into the Van Cleef & Arpels boutique in Paris, you can buy relaunched versions of these. Don't know what they smell like. But they too are going to run you several $100s. So whether you get the new relaunched one in Paris or you get one of these old ones, you're still going to pay too much money. This one I actually like more than Tsar, right? The original Van Cleef & Arpels men's fragrance. It would later be called Pour Homme, but these old bottles don't say Pour Homme on them, but the newer ones would say Pour Homme. This is more of a carnation, castoreum leather, a little bit of soapiness. Like, take something like Monsieur Houbigant or Monsieur Musk, maybe Monsieur Lanvin, right? Cross them up with Paco Rabanne and Bogart signature, and then crown it with a bit of like castoreum. Make a real dark, broody, leathery, floral thing that's a bit soapy. Just Dracula, you know, with a carnation in his lapel. That's this. And to me, that's just very interesting. I don't know if it's $400 interesting, but it's certainly interesting. So I enjoy it. But I will let you decide if you think it's enough to, spend rent money on. I personally don't think so. Now, this video is running out of time, so I will wind this up with a few quick fires on other unicorn fragrances that when I bought them they weren't, but I guess they are now. Let's see. We can talk about okay. Much more recent fragrance. This is one of those I told you about how it doesn't have to be vintage to be a unicorn necessarily. And it's this guy right here. This L'Homme Ultime is a flanker to the original YSL L'Homme from 2006. This came out exactly 10 years later in 2016. And this is a very interesting fragrance. It kind of takes the L'Homme DNA, if you will. That word gets overused, or that phrase, DNA, gets overused, but it takes the L'Homme structure and it adds clary sage in the form of sclarine. So not real clary sage, but it adds sclarine and it grafts a sort of like a rose geranium, not true rose, but like a rose geranium note. So you get rose geranium and sclarine mixed into your L'Homme, and it makes for a very classy, more mature, dressier, slightly more put on airs take on L'Homme. And it was one of those, again, like Rive Gauche Pour Homme, where a lot of people loved it and talked about it constantly, but that didn't equal sales. People online can sing the praises, right? Okay, even like an influencer, like one of the ones I mentioned, YouTube, can sing the praises, but if it doesn't equate to in-store sales, it gets discontinued. And all the influencers and forum trolls in the world can talk about how great something is. If people aren't buying it in Macy's and people aren't buying it in Ulta or whatever, bye-bye. And that's what happened. The community talked about this a lot, but that didn't mean real-world sales, so And then prices went, whew, and I felt sad. But I've got backups of this because I planned to wear this at my own funeral. Yeah, I'm going to wear this at my own funeral. I'm going to jump out of my coffin and spray some on and be like, peace, y'all, and then go back into the grave wearing this. So that's my plan. Anyway. Now I'd like you to share some of your unicorn stories with me. Some of fragrances that you bought. Maybe they weren't unicorns when you got them. Maybe they were cheap, like I said. Starter fragrances that found themselves off the market. Price shot up. Tell me what you think. And people who I name dropped in this video, clearly I don't really have any ill will towards you. I mean, obviously, I'm not a hateful person. I can be annoyed at you. I can say your behavior pisses me off. But it's not like I'm going to sit there and punch you in the face or something if I see you in person. I'm not that weird kind of basement incel guy that has it out for people. That's just not me. So if you manage to find this video and you hear me talk shit about you, and you think it's something like real slander, and you try and like come at me with lawyers, I'm gonna laugh at you. Because I'm like, I haven't negatively impacted your business in any real way, or your life in any real way. I'm just some random dude in his own living room doing videos on a cell phone. So kindly fuck off if you can't take it lighthearted. And for everyone else, Merry Christmas. Hope you enjoyed the video.